Before we dive in, let me just say this. Sometimes history looks like progress, like peace, like music that brings people together. But if you look closer, you'll see the cracks. You'll see the moments when everything beautiful turns dark, when the people in charge make choices that put thousands at risk, and ordinary people pay the price. Today, I want to take you back to two very different moments in time: 1969 at the Altamont Speedway Free Festival and 2023 in East Palestine, Ohio. On the surface, they couldn't be more different. One was a rock concert, the other a small town disaster. But underneath, they share the same painful truth that when power and profit come first, safety is always the sacrifice. This isn't just about music or trains, it's about what happens when we place trust in systems that don't deserve it. And it's about the chaos, the betrayal, and the broken trust that follow. So, sit back. Let's unravel this dark history together. Chapter 1: The Bones Beneath Our Lives. You know, sometimes I catch myself thinking about the everyday things we take for granted. The bridges we cross on the way to work, the tap water we drink without a second thought, the power lines humming quietly above our heads. These things feel so normal, so permanent that we hardly notice them. But the truth is, they're fragile. They're part of something we call infrastructure. And once you realize what that word really means, it changes the way you see the world around you. I'll be honest, for a long time, infrastructure just sounded like one of those cold, political buzzwords tossed around during debates. Something boring. Something that didn't affect me directly. But when I started digging, I realized it's basically the skeleton of our entire society. It's the bones and arteries that keep everything functioning. The roads that carry us, the schools where kids spend their days, the sewage systems that make sure our cities don't drown in filth, the pipes that bring us water, and the power grids that let us turn on the lights without even thinking. Infrastructure is the invisible machine that allows life to keep moving forward. But here's the chilling part: that machine is old, very old. And in many ways, it's breaking down right underneath us. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, the United States gave its own infrastructure a grade of C-. Imagine taking home a report card like that. You wouldn't be proud, right? You'd be worried. And you should be. Think about it: the last time America replaced most of its major water pipes was over 100 years ago. 100 years. That means the same rusty pipes carrying water to millions of homes today are the ones that were put in place when Teddy Roosevelt was president. Every time you pour a glass of water, there's a chance it's flowing through metal that's been sitting underground since before your grandparents were even born. And yet, despite being one of the richest nations in the world, we drive on cracked highways, cross bridges that inspectors have already labeled as unsafe, and live in cities where entire systems are at risk of collapse. It's unsettling, isn't it? Because you realize you're not as safe as you thought you were. For me, the scariest part isn't just the age of these systems. It's the way we stop noticing them until something goes terribly wrong. A bridge doesn't collapse every day, but when it does, it's catastrophic. A dam doesn't break every week, but when it finally gives way, entire communities are wiped off the map. And these disasters, when they happen, they don't feel like random accidents. They feel like the price we pay for years of ignoring problems we knew were there all along. In a way, this story isn't just about pipes and bridges, it's about trust. We trust that the road beneath our car won't crumble. We trust that clean water will come out of the faucet. We trust that the people in charge are making sure everything is safe. But what if they aren't? What if that trust has been misplaced for decades? That's why I wanted to talk about this today. Because infrastructure might sound boring at first, but it's not. It's a story about life and death, about greed and neglect, about the hidden dangers that we walk over, drive across, and drink from every single day without realizing how close we are to disaster. So let's peel back the surface. Let's go back to the beginning, to the moments when America decided to rebuild itself from the ground up, and look at how some of the biggest tragedies in history were born not from chance, but from choices. Chapter 2: The Promise of Progress. When we talk about the bones of America's infrastructure, we can't skip over one of the biggest turning points in history: the New Deal. If Chapter 1 was about the skeleton hiding beneath our lives, then this part of the story is about the moment someone tried to rebuild that skeleton stronger, bigger, more modern. Picture this, it's the 1930s, the Great Depression. People are standing in breadlines that stretch for blocks. Families are losing their homes. Farmers are watching their crops turn to dust. Hope feels like it's slipping away. And then President Franklin D. Roosevelt comes along and tells the nation, we can build our way out of this. And he meant it, literally. The New Deal wasn't just a political slogan. It was hammers and nails, bricks and steel. It was about putting millions of unemployed Americans to work, digging canals, building schools, stringing electrical lines across the countryside, and raising massive dams that seemed to defy nature itself. If you drive across the United States today, you'll still see traces of those projects. Bridges, post offices, highways, all stamped with the fingerprints of people who lived nearly a century ago. To many families, this was salvation. Work meant food on the table. It meant dignity. It meant purpose. And on the surface, it looked like progress. It looked like a nation pulling itself out of despair by sheer willpower and construction. But here's where it gets dark. Those gleaming projects, those marvels of engineering, they weren't built for everyone. Black workers, Native communities, Mexican laborers. Many of them were shut out of the jobs or pushed into the hardest, most dangerous tasks with the lowest pay. Even the Social Security system, which was created to protect workers, originally excluded farm workers and domestic workers, jobs largely filled by people of color. Progress, yes, but progress with cracks already forming in the foundation. And even for the communities that did benefit, there was a hidden cost. Massive dams like the Hoover Dam changed entire ecosystems. Rivers were rerouted, towns were flooded, and people were displaced, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. Families who had lived on that land for generations were told to pack up and move, sacrificed in the name of progress. I think about that a lot, because when we look back at the New Deal, it's so easy to romanticize it, to imagine America finally working together for a common goal. And yes, it did lift millions out of poverty, but at the same time, it planted seeds of inequality and environmental damage that would grow and spread for decades to come. It's a reminder that when a government promises progress, we should always ask progress for who. And here's the haunting part. The same dams, highways, and power lines built during the New Deal are still the ones we rely on today. They were never meant to last forever, but we act as though they will. We drive over bridges from the 1930s. We depend on water systems designed when the world had half the population it does now. We put our faith in infrastructure that was built for a past America, not the one we live in today. So yes, the New Deal was a promise that America could rise from despair through sheer effort. But it was also the start of a dangerous illusion that if something is built big enough, strong enough, it will last forever. And history shows us it never does. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Foundation. By the time the mid-20th century rolled around, America looked like it was booming. Highways stretched like veins across the country, cities reached higher into the sky, and families moved into shiny new suburbs with their white picket fences. On the surface, it was the American dream. But dreams, especially ones built too quickly, always come with cracks. Let me take you back to the 1940s and 1950s. This was the age of concrete. Highways, bridges, and dams were going up at a speed that felt unstoppable. But the thing about building at lightning speed is that safety and oversight often get pushed aside. Corners were cut, materials were cheaper than they should have been, inspections were rushed or ignored, and the cracks, literal cracks, were beginning to show. One of the first big wake-up calls was the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in 1940. They called it Galloping Gertie. And honestly, if you watch the footage, it's terrifying. This massive suspension bridge in Washington state twisted and buckled in the wind until it finally snapped and plunged into the water. Miraculously, very few lives were lost that day. But the collapse was a symbol, a warning that maybe America was building faster than it was thinking. And it wasn't just bridges. Dams that were supposed to represent the pinnacle of human achievement began to fail too. Entire towns were wiped out when walls of water burst through poorly designed structures. Each disaster left behind not just rubble, but grief loss, and a growing question: how safe was this progress we were so proud of? What made it worse was the way these events were often brushed aside. Officials would blame acts of God like storms or bad weather instead of looking at the deeper issue that the systems themselves weren't built to last. That, or they were never maintained the way they should have been. And then there's the environmental cost. Rivers dammed for power led to entire ecosystems collapsing. Fish populations vanished. Forests were drowned. Native lands were stolen and submerged under artificial lakes. The shiny promise of progress came with shadows, shadows that rarely made the headlines. For everyday people, though, these cracks weren't abstract, they were real. They showed up in the form of blackouts, water shortages, bridges that rattled a little too much when you drove across them. Ordinary families started to feel the unease, that maybe the miracle wasn't as solid as everyone wanted to believe. I think about this a lot. How history keeps repeating the same story, something new is built. Everyone cheers, and then slowly the cracks begin to show. And instead of fixing the cracks, we plaster over them, pretending they don't exist. The mid-century boom was supposed to be proof that America had mastered the art of infrastructure. Instead, it quietly revealed a truth we didn't want to face. We were building a future on shaky ground, and those cracks. They weren't going away, they were only spreading. Chapter 4. When Warnings Go Ignored. By the time the 1960s hit, the cracks in America's shiny infrastructure weren't just whispers anymore, they were screams. Engineers, inspectors, and sometimes even ordinary townspeople were raising red flags. But too often those warnings fell on deaf ears. And here's the thing about ignored warnings, they don't just disappear. They wait, they build. Until one day, they explode. One of the darkest examples came in 1963 in Italy at the Vajont Dam. Now, this wasn't in the US, but it's important because it became a chilling lesson the whole world should have learned from. The dam itself didn't break, but the mountains around it did. Engineers had been warned for years that the slope above the reservoir was unstable, that the ground was literally shifting beneath them, but the project kept moving forward. And then one night, a massive landslide crashed into the reservoir, sending a tsunami of water over the dam. Entire villages downstream were wiped off the map in minutes. Over 2,000 people died, not because of nature, but because human warnings had been ignored. You'd think a tragedy like that would change things right, that governments and companies would finally start listening. But back in the US, the same pattern played out again and again. I think of the Buffalo Creek disaster in 1972 West Virginia. It was a coal mining community. The company had built these giant slurry ponds to hold back waste, basically toxic sludge left over from mining. People who lived in the valley below knew the dam was weak. They saw the leaks, they heard the creaks, and they begged the company to do something. But nothing changed. And then, after days of heavy rain, the dam broke. A wall of black water, thick with coal waste, roared down into the valley. 125 people were killed, thousands were left homeless, and an entire community was scarred forever. What still stuns me is how predictable it all was. Residents had been warning about it for years. Inspectors had flagged concerns, and yet nothing happened until it was too late. It's like people in power couldn't imagine the cost until they saw the bodies pulled from the mud. These weren't isolated events. Bridges collapsed, mines caved in, buildings crumbled. And in every case, there was someone, an engineer, a worker, a local resident, who had seen the cracks before anyone else and tried to raise the alarm. But progress is a seductive word. Back then, admitting to a flaw wasn't seen as responsible, it was seen as weakness. Admitting your dam might fail or your bridge might collapse wasn't an opportunity to fix things. It was an invitation for blame lawsuits and financial loss. So the truth got buried, right along with the people who would eventually pay the price. When I look back at this part of history, what chills me the most isn't just the disasters themselves, it's the silence before them. The way people begged to be heard and were ignored. That silence, more than the storm or the rain or the shifting earth, was what killed. And the scariest part, that silence is still around today. Chapter 5. Greed at the Core. If there's one thread that ties so many of these disasters together, it's this: profit came first and people came last. And honestly, that's the part that keeps me up at night. Think about it: dams, mines, railroads, even entire cities were being built on the promise of growth and wealth. And in the boardrooms where those decisions were made, safety was always the line item that could be trimmed. Take the Buffalo Creek disaster I mentioned earlier. That coal company wasn't just negligent, it was calculated. They built those slurry dams with scraps, basically piles of waste on top of waste, because it was cheaper than doing it the right way. And when locals raised their concerns, the company downplayed it, even calling one of the dams perfectly safe. Weeks later, it gave way. And after the deaths, after the destruction, the company had the audacity to call it an act of God. Not poor construction, not corporate greed, God. That same mindset played out with railroads. In 1991, the Sunset Limited train derailed in Alabama after the tracks had been left vulnerable by poor infrastructure and ignored maintenance. 47 people died because keeping things in top condition was too expensive. Over and over again, the pattern repeats. It wasn't that people didn't know better, they just didn't care enough. And maybe that's the darkest crime of all. Not murder in the traditional sense, but something colder. Because at least murder usually has passion behind it, anger, jealousy, something human. But these disasters, they came from indifference, from suits in offices who never looked the victims in the eye, from people who knew the risks but gambled anyway, because saving money felt worth more than saving lives. What strikes me is how often those in power shifted blame. Instead of saying, we should have done better, they'd spin it an act of God, a freak accident, a once-in-a-lifetime event. But the truth, these weren't accidents. They were choices. Choices made by people who thought no one would hold them accountable. And in many cases, they were right. Companies walked away with a slap on the wrist, sometimes even profiting from documentaries or rebuilding contracts after the destruction. Meanwhile, families buried their loved ones and tried to rebuild their lives from rubble. When you peel away the layers of concrete and steel, what you really find at the heart of America's deadliest infrastructure, failures isn't weak engineering, it's greed. Cold, calculated, everyday greed. And if you've ever wondered why people today don't trust big corporations or government promises of safety first, well, history gave them plenty of reasons. Chapter 6: Inside the Chaos. When we talk about these disasters, it's easy to get lost in the big numbers: hundreds, dead thousands, displaced millions of dollars in damages. But numbers don't capture the chaos. They don't tell you what it felt like to be there when everything came apart. Picture this: it's December 6th, 1969. You're standing at the Altamont Speedway. The sun is going down, the air is cold, and the Rolling Stones are about to play. What should have been a historic night of music turns into a nightmare. There are no fences, no real stage, no proper security. Instead, there are Hell's Angels with beer in their hands and chains at their sides. People are high, desperate, and crammed shoulder to shoulder. And then you hear the first scream. A fight breaks out. You see fists, boots, blood. The music keeps playing, but the vibe is gone. The festival that was meant to be Woodstock's twin becomes its evil shadow. Now fast forward decades later to East Palestine, Ohio in 2023. Different time, same chaos. People weren't packed into a concert, they were living their quiet, small-town lives when a freight train carrying toxic chemicals derailed. I've listened to residents describe it: the sound of metal tearing the ground, shaking a fireball, lighting up the night sky. Families grabbed their kids, their pets, and ran without knowing where to go. Some described the air burning their throats, the smell of chemicals clinging to their clothes. And as officials argued over whether it was safe to stay, people felt abandoned in their own homes, unsure if their water or soil would ever be clean again. It's moments like these when the word chaos feels too small. Because it's not just panic, it's confusion. No one knows who's in charge. At Altamont, fans didn't know if the angels were protecting them or attacking them. In Ohio, residents didn't know if government officials were telling the truth or just protecting the railroad company. And what hits me hardest is how similar the emotions are across decades. Fear, anger, betrayal. Whether it's music fans beaten at a concert or families choking on toxic fumes in their hometown, people are left asking the same question. Why wasn't this prevented? Chaos doesn't happen out of nowhere. It's the direct result of choices, bad planning, ignored warnings, and leaders who gamble with other people's lives. And for the people stuck in the middle, chaos isn't just something they survive. It's something they never forget. Chapter 7: The power of the story. One of the things that fascinates me about disasters is how the story gets told afterward. Because the truth is, what we remember often depends less on what happened and more on how it was presented to us. Take Altamont. If you weren't there in 1969, chances are the way you know the story is through the Rolling Stones documentary, Gimme Shelter. That film captured the chaos, yes, but it also shifted the blame. You see shaky footage of the stabbing. You see Mick Jagger looking worried. And it leaves you thinking the band was just unlucky, caught in a storm they couldn't control. But was that really the whole truth? Behind the scenes, the Stones had planned the festival, poorly insisted on the Hells Angels as security, and ignored warnings about safety. Yet the narrative that stuck in the public mind was that the Angels alone turned a dream into a nightmare. The way the film was edited, what they chose to show, and what they left out protected the band's reputation. Now fast forward to East Palestine in 2023. The way people first heard about the train derailment wasn't through polished film crews, it was through shaky phone videos on social media. Flames rising into the night, black smoke curling over small houses, parents coughing while holding their kids. At first, national outlets barely touched it. But the residents themselves became the storytellers, posting live updates, forcing the world to pay attention. Here's the difference at Altamont. The powerful controlled the narrative. At East Palestine, ordinary people fought to make sure their voices weren't drowned out. But in both cases, the way the story was told shaped public perception more than the events themselves. And here's the chilling part. When the truth doesn't make it into the story, justice often doesn't either. At Altamont, only one man was held responsible, Alan Passaro, the Hells Angel who stabbed Meredith Hunter. The larger failures, the systemic issues, those were buried under a slick rock and roll film. In Ohio, residents are still fighting to be heard above corporate press releases and government reassurances. The derailment may fade from headlines, but the contamination lingers in their soil and water. Stories have power. They can expose injustice, but they can also cover it up. And when you look closely, you realize that disasters aren't just about what happened, they're about who gets to tell the story afterward and whose voices get erased. Chapter 8. The Blame Game. Whenever disaster strikes, there's always a scramble to find someone to blame. It's human nature. We want a clear villain, a single person or group we can point to and say, it's their fault. But reality is never that simple. At Altamont, blame became a game of hot potato. The Rolling Stones blamed the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels blamed the crowd. Some people blamed the Grateful Dead for suggesting the bikers as security in the first place. And plenty of journalists pointed fingers at the Stones' management for rushing a massive event with no real plan. But here's the thing. Nobody wanted to take responsibility. Everyone tried to distance themselves from the tragedy of Meredith Hunter's death and the dozens of assaults and injuries. In the end, one man stood trial, but the larger truth, that the festival was doomed by arrogance and neglect, never saw justice. And in East Palestine, decades later, it feels like déjà vu. Norfolk Southern. The company that owned the train issued statements about safety, but avoided acknowledging years of cutbacks and ignored warning systems. Government agencies pointed fingers at each other, state leaders blaming federal regulators, federal leaders insisting the state should have acted faster. Meanwhile, the residents were stuck in the middle, watching politicians and executives argue while their kids coughed and their pets died from chemical exposure. It makes me think blaming one group or person almost always lets the bigger system off the hook. At Altamont, focusing on a single stabbing let the music industry ignore its own recklessness. In Ohio, blaming one derailment allows corporations to keep running trains with outdated brakes and overworked crews. The truth is, disasters are rarely about one bad actor. They're about a chain of choices, each one made to save money, to cut corners, or to protect reputations. And yet, who pays the price? Not the organizers, not the executives. It's always the people caught in the middle. The fans who just wanted to hear music, the families who just wanted safe homes. They're the ones who end up carrying the scars, sometimes literally for the rest of their lives. What I've learned is that the blame game is never about justice. it's about protecting power. And when the spotlight moves on the people who suffered, are often left in the dark with no accountability, no closure, and no one willing to admit what really went wrong. Chapter 9. Aftermath and Broken Trust. The strangest part about tragedies like these is how quickly the world moves on. For the people who lived through them, the scars last a lifetime. But for everyone else, the disaster becomes a headline, a footnote, or maybe just a dark story, told years later. After Altamont, the Rolling Stones kept touring. Their documentary, Gimme Shelter, reframed them as survivors of chaos rather than creators of it. The Hells Angels went back to riding their reputation, both feared and strangely glamorized. The music industry carried on as if nothing had changed. But for those who were there, the ones who were beaten, the ones who saw Meredith Hunter die in front of them, the memory never faded. Altamont wasn't just the end of a concert. For many, it was the end of believing in the peace and love spirit of the 1960s. It was the night trust broke. And in East Palestine, decades later, I hear the same echoes. Residents still live in homes they no longer trust. They look at their tap water and wonder if it's poison. They see dead fish floating in streams and know the government's reassurances don't match reality. Some families left and never came back. Others stayed, but live in constant fear of cancer years down the road of their children growing up sick. What connects these two stories is the betrayal. At Altamont, fans trusted the organizers to give them a safe space, but that trust was shattered in violence. In Ohio, people trusted that trains carrying dangerous chemicals were regulated, that their government would protect them. That trust dissolved in the smoke rising from the wreckage. And here's the bitter truth. Once trust is broken, it's almost impossible to rebuild. Festivals became more regulated after Altamont, yes. Transportation safety laws were debated after East Palestine, yes. But for the individuals who lived it, the damage was already done. The aftermath of disasters isn't just about rebuilding roads or cleaning up chemicals or holding a trial. It's about whether people can still believe in the systems meant to protect them. And when that belief dies, something larger dies with it, the sense that we're safe in our own society. Chapter 10. Lessons we refuse to learn. Looking back on Altamont and East Palestine. It's hard not to see the pattern. Different decades, different settings. One was a music festival, the other a small American town. But both ended in tragedy for the same reason those in charge put image profit and convenience above human lives. At Altamont, the Rolling Stones wanted a grand finale to their tour, something bigger and bolder than Woodstock. But instead of careful planning, they leaned on improvisation. Instead of hiring trained security, they handed beer to a biker gang and hoped for the best. The result was chaos, violence, and a young man, Meredith Hunter, losing his life on camera. In East Palestine, a massive corporation cut costs, lobbied against safety regulations, and pushed trains longer and faster than ever. And when the inevitable happened, a derailment and chemical spill, the community, not the company, paid the price. Families were left with poisoned water, unanswered questions, and a lingering sense that they'd been abandoned. What ties these stories together is the warning they carry. Disasters don't just happen. They're built decision by decision until the weight of neglect comes crashing down on ordinary people. And too often, the powerful walk away, their reputations intact, while the victims are left with scars no one sees. If there's one thing I've taken away from these stories, it's this: safety isn't an accident, and neither is disaster. Both are the direct result of choices. And until we demand better from our leaders, from corporations, from the people who profit off our trust, we'll keep repeating the same mistakes. Altamont was supposed to be the Woodstock of the West. East Palestine was supposed to be just another quiet American town. Both became symbols of what happens when promises collapse under the weight of negligence. And maybe the real dark history here isn't just what happened on those nights, but how easily we forget until it happens all over again. When I think about Altamont and East Palestine, I can't help but feel the weight of repetition. Two events separated by more than 50 years, but built on the same foundations: negligence, greed, and the belief that ordinary people will endure whatever fallout comes their way. The truth is, disasters don't just mark the end of a concert or the derailment of a train. They mark the end of trust. And once that's gone, rebuilding isn't as simple as fixing a stage or cleaning up a spill. It lingers in memories, in health, in the quiet fear that it could happen again. Maybe the real lesson here is that safety doesn't just happen. It has to be demanded, enforced, and protected. Because when we stop paying attention, history has a way of repeating itself. Thank you for joining me today on True Crime Echoes. If this story resonated with you, I hope you'll carry it with you, not just as history, but as a reminder to question, to demand better, and to never let the powerful rewrite the truth. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember the past isn't really past. It's still with us, echoing in the present.